So in this map, we're going to take a look at examples of nationalism and examples of imperialism. In order to gain raw materials and markets for their goods, many European powers used technological advances and their standing armies to establish control over new colonies around the world. Let's start with Great Britain. If you could, please denote Great Britain with GB on your map. Here is Great Britain. And let's take a look at where Great Britain is colonizing. Great Britain colonizes a great deal of the world. Great Britain had colonized Canada from earlier colonization, so please draw an arrow there. Great Britain had colonized much of Africa. India particularly, please draw an arrow to India and label India. Great Britain had colonized Australia. Please draw an arrow to Australia, as well as parts of Asia as well, notably China. Next, please find Germany on your map. Germany, if you recall, is in the center of Europe there, and denote Germany with a G. Germany gains colonies in Africa particularly. If you can draw an arrow there to Central Africa. It also gains a portion of New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and Marshall Islands as well. But notably, we associate Germany with their colonies in Central Africa. The other country that is imperializing at this time is the United States. Let's denote the United States with US. The United States goes to war with Mexico and makes takes huge amounts of land from Mexico. You can denote that with an arrow of invasion of Mexico. In addition, the United States had added the Philippines. Let's draw an arrow to the Philippines, which would be onto the other side of the map here. This is the Philippines. And Hawaii as territories. Hawaii would be here in the middle of the Pacific. Another country that is imperializing at this time is Japan. Let's denote Japan with a J. Japan expands to Taiwan in 1895. This is Taiwan here. Then to Korea. This is Korea here. Then Manchuria. And it really this is Manchuria, and it signals a break with the other Asian nations in the region. Japan is really stepping out, and it's going to become an imperial power in Asia. Let's look over back at Europe at Italy. Italy, remember, is the boot that juts out of Europe. Here is Italy. Let's denote it with an I. Italy is notable because it fails to actually conquer Ethiopia here. Here is Ethiopia, and let's label that. Another country that is trying to imperialize is France. France has a little bit more success. France is going to claim large parts of West Africa, that is this area here. Let's draw an arrow there. And it's going to claim large parts of Asia, particularly French Indochina. And we can denote that with the F arrow here. This is French Indochina, what is today Vietnam. Another country that is trying to imperialize, that is, take raw materials from other places, is Russia. And here we have Russia. Let's label Russia and show its arrows. It's expanding in the late 1800s to the Black Sea. This is an arrow to the Black Sea. South into the Caucasus, Turkestan, and into Manchuria. This is an arrow into Manchuria. You can see that Russia and Japan are going to come into conflict as they compete over this territory. And finally, let's end with Belgium. Belgium is a small country here located north of France. Belgium claims a huge colony in Congo, and we can denote that with a CO on Congo. It's the personal property of King Leopold, the King of Belgium. This is of note because some of the worst atrocities, the worst abuses of native African people occurs here in the Congo. And we'll talk more about that later in this unit. Of course, the countries that the imperial powers are trying to take over resist. Many of these countries resist the occupiers. Let's start with talking about India. Again, remember, Great Britain is trying to colonize India. In 1857, the Sepoy Mutiny, in which Indian soldiers rebelled, captured Delhi, and the British were forced to take more than a year to regain control of India. In 1885, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League in 1906 called for self-government. We'll talk more about India later in the unit. Let's look over at China. China as well attempts to limit the power of Europeans and Americans to these few port cities along its coast. There was a strong Chinese identity and pride that maintained traditional culture and limited acceptance of Western ways. So really few Western goods were desired by the Chinese. However, one of the goods that the Chinese did eventually want was opium. The British introduced the drug opium, a very addictive drug, into China to create a demand for a British product. The Chinese tried to stop this. Obviously, they didn't want their people addicted to opium. This led to what became known as the Opium Wars, in which China battled Great Britain to keep opium out of its ports. Unfortunately, the modern military technology really favored Great Britain, and China was forced to accept trading terms that were favorable to European powers, which meant that they had to accept opium sales in their country. Anger with this foreign influence led to what's called the Boxer Rebellion, which was quickly crushed by a multinational force of Europeans, and the Chinese were forced to pay for damages. Let's now look over at Ethiopia. Ethiopian forces were able to successfully defeat Italian invading force in 1896. And Ethiopia stands out because it is one of the few countries that is able to resist an imperial occupation. And then let's look over here at Congo. Unfortunately, at least 10 million people of Congo died due to the abuses during King Leopold's rule. But the people of Congo did continue to resist. Looking over at Southeast Asia, here labeled on the map SEA, Southeast Asia, we find the Philippines that fought against Spanish rule and then fought against American rule. At least 250,000 civilians died in the Philippine-American War. Millions of people also migrated to the region to work on plantations, mines, and this is an area that becomes very diverse very quickly. Now let's talk about another country that was resisting imperialism, and that's New Zealand. New Zealand was occupied by the native Maori people, who were almost wiped out by diseases and alcoholism brought by Europeans. The survivors, however, were able to gain some rights as they pressed against the British occupation. And finally, let's look over at Mexico. Mexico fought and lost a war against the United States, but it would continue to fight against American intervention. And interestingly, that dynamic, that tension between Mexico and the United States over territory and industrialization and imperialism has legacies today. So again, double check that your map has these areas of resistance that we've just talked about shaded in a special color to denote that these are places where resistance is occurring. We're going to come back to these places, these rebellions, a little bit later on. Remember, the point of this is to say that in order to gain these raw materials and markets to sell their goods, European powers used these technological advances and these large militaries that they had developed to establish control over new colonies around the world. In those colonies, they would then gain raw materials from those places and have a captive audience to sell their goods from their factories.